The first question, getting right to business, is a question that comes up all the time when it comes to looking at research on hypertrophy and just practical programming. By the way, the question comes from Chuck the One-Eyed Dog. What is the best way to calculate volume for hypertrophy training? Hard sets regardless of reps? Reps times weight times sets? Question mark?
Yeah, so this has been a topic of a fair amount of debate. So the traditional way to calculate volume for normalizing programs within the literature has been to use volume load, which is sets times reps times weight. Multiply those together, it gives you your tonnage, nice happy number in pounds and kilograms. It feels very scientific because you're calculating something. And that's what was used pretty much exclusively in the literature to normalize training programs and to equate them for decades, like at least 2 or 3 decades. And as best I can tell, someone just started doing that and everyone else followed suit. There wasn't a rigorous process leading up to that to make sure that that was actually the best way to equate training volume, assuming you're interested in, something that will theoretically equate outcomes as well. That was just a convention, and so that's what everyone did. Tons of people still calculate their tonnage as if it actually means something. However, when we look at the research, we see a whole lot of instances where tonnage is different. The number of sets performed is the same, and hypertrophy is the same. So most of those studies are comparing kind of normal moderate rep, moderate load training to low load training. So for example, doing sets of 8 to 10 reps per set with about 70-75% of 1 rep max, to doing sets of 20 to 35 reps per set with below 50% 1 rep max. In virtually all of the studies that have used that kind of experimental setup and have equated the number of sets performed, you see very, very similar hypertrophy but much higher volume loads with the low load training condition. So it seems like the number of hard sets is a better way to equate training if you're interested in hypertrophy outcomes. So another thing I'll just generally note is that even if you kind of hew to the traditionalist idea of the classic hypertrophy range of 8 to 12 reps per set, even there, like, volume load's going to be way higher if you're doing sets of 12 versus sets of 8. It's probably going to be 30-40% higher, give or take. So, like, ultimately, I don't know what you are measuring besides tonnage. Like, it gives you something to calculate, but is it worth calculating something that doesn't ultimately mean anything with regards to the training outcomes you're interested in? So just to nuance this a little bit, when you equate the number of hard sets pretty close to failure or to failure that are performed, seems like hypertrophy is pretty similar, but there's ends to that range. So for really, really low rep stuff, so here probably thinking triples and below, you probably need to do more sets to get similar hypertrophic outcomes to higher rep training. And if the load gets below about 30% of 1 rep max, it seems like hypertrophy on a per set basis starts dropping off as well. There was a recent study testing that where they compared training at, I believe, 20, 40, 60, and 80% of 1 rep max. They found similar hypertrophy with loads between 40 and 80% of 1 rep max, but quite a bit less growth with 20% 1 rep max. So there are edges to that range. But probably for sets of between, I don't know, maybe 4 and 40 or 50 reps, it seems like if you're doing the same number of sets, hypertrophy on a per set basis is pretty similar. If you get too heavy, so probably, 85 to 90-ish% plus, like heavy doubles and triples, hypertrophy drops off. If you get below 30% 1 rep max, I don't know why you ever would. unless you're a subject in one of these studies. But if that happens, probably a little bit lower hypertrophy per set. But through the range where most people train in, hard set seems to be the way to go. So that is if we're interested in hypertrophy. I think...
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Yeah, go for it.
You mentioned like you don't know why somebody would go below 30. When there's first a lot of like lively discussion about the study showing like 30% 1RM resulting in a decent amount of hypertrophy. Even with that, I'm like, people were acting like it was some kind of hack. Like, oh, sweet, you can only lift with 30%. I'm like, who wants to do that, man? Like,
yeah,
that's not a fun way to train at all.
I mean, I could see doing it for like curls or tricep extensions or something. If you're kind of masochistic and you're going for a ridiculous pump and to be in a reasonable amount of localized agony for a very long period of time, sure. But doing that for like squats or deadlifts, fuck that.
I was at a conference once and somebody was sharing their results on one of those types of studies. And they mentioned that doing bicep curls with 30% 1 rep max, one of their participants developed rhabdomyolysis doing bicep curls.
What?
And I believe they actually ended up publishing a case report on that subject.
That's wild.
But like, can you imagine how intense that set of curls was, man?
That's a more intense set of curls than I have personally ever experienced.
Yeah, me too.
So the one thing I will say in favor of volume load is that it's probably pretty good if you're trying to predict the metabolic cost of training. So one thing that we know is caloric expenditure scales with work performed, so work here in the physics sense. And I mean, unless you have a lab setup, the best proxy you're probably going to get for that is volume load. So I think that worrying about volume load, if you're specifically trying to improve work capacity, so just purely the ability to do work in a session and recover between sets, I think volume load's probably a pretty useful metric then. Or if for whatever reason you're trying to maximize caloric expenditure during a training session, volume load's probably a pretty decent metric then. But for just purely interest in hypertrophy, number of hard sets seems to be the way to go for most circumstances.